Quite famously or infamously, William James once said that philosophy was the search in a dark room for a black cat that wasn't there. Then he added, but that was William James, who had many religious sentiments, that if someone within religion had sought for the cat, that person would have found the cat anyway. What I want to talk about is the room and a search for the room in which that investigation might occur. And I'm trying to find ways to reach a certain threshold that leads into a dark or light room in which one might be looking for certain things. Let me start by reference to something said by Immanuel Kant, which I think is still very true and very important. He said, when it came down to it, the questions of philosophy narrow to the three following questions. What can I know? What ought I do? And for what might I hope? I really think those are the fundamental questions of philosophy. It was wonderful that Kant would have said that, because he's almost impossible to read. He deals with very technical matters, but what drives him are these questions. And interestingly, he says that insofar as we fail to ask these questions, we're a little less human. There's soft and hard dehumanization. Let's think of failing to ask questions about what our hopes might appropriately be as a kind of soft and reassuring form of dehumanization, about which Kant himself had great concern. I can't remember the year specifically. I think it might have been 1908 now. Kant was end of the 18th century. Freud said in a letter to Marie Bonaparte that these sorts of questions that Kant was raising, that Kant said we needed to raise if we were to be fully human, well, to the degree that you were concerned about those questions, it was probably symptomatic of a kind of illness which might benefit from, in Freud's case, the talking cure. We do know in our time that through pharmacological advance, which we're not always sure is advance, there are ways in which we can actually dampen the desire or concern to ask those kinds of questions, because they seem too large, they seem too global, they may not seem manageable. But the sort of threshold I'm talking about is one in which those questions can come up again. Professional philosophy has a great deal of difficulty asking those questions because they don't seem sophisticated, they don't seem altogether manageable. I was mentioning at the table that I served a brief term on the committee of the status and future of the philosophy profession. My colleagues in the profession elected me to that. I think it was a desire to put Typhoid Mary in the intensive care ward to see what she would do. I had said notoriously that the status of the profession, if it didn't open up more, was probably going down, and the future would be bleak. Well, where might philosophy be renewed? I think it well might be outside of the academy, though I hope this isn't going to go on YouTube. I have to go back to work, off and on, in the academy, which has been very good to me, and my colleagues have been very good to me. But anyway, it's something to think about. We have been living through the late stages of what I will call the Axial age. That was a term that was first used as a label for it by Karl Jaspers, a German philosopher who lived mostly in the 20th century. What is this Axial age? Well, it's an age in which it is believed that what human life involves is a certain kind of journey. A journey from appearance to reality, if you would get there, whether through scientific investigation or spiritual insight. A journey from bondage to liberation, Some will say if you know the truth, it will make you free. Others might say if you can be liberated, then you can seek the truth in an open way. But the axial mind, a mentality that I think still lingers, perhaps will be rekindled, perhaps will die out, is a mentality that thinks that whether we are fully aware of it or not, we understand life as this journey from appearance to reality, bondage to liberation, from confusion to insight or enlightenment. You might take that, for example, in a Buddhist sense. You could take it in a psychoanalytic sense. There are other senses in which you could take it. The view has always been also that it's a movement from darkness to light. Appearance to reality, bondage to liberation, confusion to insight or enlightenment, darkness to light. We need to say something about the Greeks in this connection, because much of philosophy in the West has been understood as rationalism. Now, what did the Greeks add to this axial mind? What they added was the sense that what we were moving from was the changing to the unchanging, so far as our journey was successful. Also the notion that we were moving from the temporal, from time to eternity. But of course, what would you mean by moving from time to eternity, or the timeless? What could that mean? Would the eternal be infinite temporal duration? Remember, John Maynard Keynes talks about the famous char lady who said, "Don't worry about me, don't worry about me never, because I'm going to heaven to live forever and ever." Okay, that would be one sense of the eternal, time that never ended. Another sense might be the timeless in this way. To the degree you live fully in the present, you're outside of time. But in any case, the notion of the unchanging, the secure and the fixed, and the notion of some escape or successful journey out of time may have been wired or built into us. I don't hold any particular views about neuroscience versus this, that, or the other, but it's been a kind of deep part of human thinking. Let's spin forward for a moment now, and let's extract something that's not always extracted from the famous, infamous proclamation of Nietzsche's that God is dead. Well, among other things, what Nietzsche had in mind, and it was no accident that he was raised as a classical philologist and studied the Greeks very intently, part of what Nietzsche had in mind was that the axial mentality couldn't sustain itself. That is, that it was becoming progressively more and more difficult to think of human life as a journey outside and beyond time, a journey to a reality in the sense of a world beyond or other than this one. He thought at the time that he wrote that we were caught in the following trap, that there was enough kind of instinct we had that there was a realm beyond this one, literal or metaphorical, that we were likely not fully to embrace this world. There was enough of it lingering, of a sense of a transcendent beyond, to make the embrace of the present highly problematic. On the other hand, this sense of a beyond, of being in but not altogether of this world, wasn't strong enough any longer to sustain us. So enough of a sense of transcendence not to allow us to embrace the present, but not enough of a sense of transcendence to sustain us. A remarkable passage he had, which I think has become even more important in about the last 30 years, though in an odd way he would have found it problematic. He says, the wasteland grows, beware those who hide wastelands within. You could take that in two ways. Beware of those who hide wastelands within. Or you could say to those who hide wastelands within, careful. Now, what would it be, for heaven's sakes, to hide a wasteland within? What could that amount to? How could that connect with the notion that, whether literal or metaphorical, once upon a time there was a world beyond this one that we more believed in than not, but more recently we believe in it less, and it can't sustain us? How does that connect with wastelands within? It's probably a bit, how shall I put it, controversial, but not too much. Probably the dominant psychoanalytic movement of the last 30 to 40 years is so-called self-psychology. Its major figure was someone named Heinz Kohut. And, for example, the Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis in Los Angeles, which has been largely centered around the work of Bob Stollerow, who is a hero to some of us because he went on to get a PhD in philosophy with a rather odd view in the middle of his life that the problems people had were philosophical problems. They weren't altogether explicable in terms of standard psychoanalytic models. In any case, this movement thought that something called empathy was fundamental to human life, and the notion that conflict was fundamental didn't quite get it right, that there was an ill or undefined sense of emptiness, of something being missing that underlay most fundamental human problems. Probably too simple, as if conflict is fundamental, or what the psychoanalytic movement would call deficit is fundamental. But let's just say there can be an issue about something being missing, an issue about deficit, a kind of inchoate longing for some kind of belonging, but that being unclear as to its source, unclear as to its direction. It does strike me that we're at such a point, at the threshold of some kind of actually major transition. I'm happy not to be alone in thinking this. A book by Peter Drucker from the management world called Post-Capitalist Society says that that happens about every 200 years. I think that book was published in about 1990. He said 30 years from then, people living then in 2020 would look back at people in 1990 and not be able to understand exactly what that kind of life might have been like, that there would be enough of a transition. Seems to me that's possible. You hate to put numbers on those things. Peter thought that this happened about every 200 years. I think that's much too frequent as a way of understanding it. My wife and I have been working on a project in this respect, and we use the notion of a comma. You come to the end of a clause, and there's a pause. I think that comma or pause is a kind of threshold. But there have been too many false attempts to go beyond it. Fukuyama, into the 80s, wasn't it? White paper for the State Department and the Pentagon. The end of history. Then we got the New World Order. Then we got the horrors that linger with us of terrorism. Then we get the financial problems of 2008 going forward. We get lots of different notions of how to continue, but they have been false starts so far. And I think false starts that should tell us that sometimes one of the hardest things to do is to learn how to wait in the right way. And it's something hard to talk about. Part of thresholding is the notion that, yes, though we are in, we're not altogether of the world. But it doesn't take that as literally true. We know the Romantics at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century thought art was the metaphorical way in which we were not altogether of the world. It's, I think, right now just hard to know what we'll make of that metaphor and what we'll do with it, but it might take a time. There might need to be a pause. I had written a few notes because I didn't think I could get the sentences to work out well, but let me give you 3 sentences. Building on earlier successes, comma, they took the next phase for granted and failed to grasp the challenge it brought. That's number 1. Number 2, building on earlier successes, they found the courage to stretch their imagination and undertake a truly daring project. Number 3, they found the confidence to delay action until the time was right. Now, that sense of timing or time being right, I find to be terribly important. I'm very consoled at times to know that 2 major writers, one now tragically the victim of suicide, David Foster Wallace, who taught at my college, and another, Franson, who has written the book Freedom, were both interviewed about the need of finding some way to find an inner space that would not deny the connectivity or interactive relations that all kinds of things like the internet make possible, but a kind of way to cultivate as well an inner space. Well, it's got a history to it. I guess if I'm a philosophy professor, I got to mention part of the history. Pascal says that so many of our problems would be solved, not all of them by any means, if we got better able to be alone with ourselves. Whitehead says religion is largely what people do with their solitude. Probably not really the right answers, but maybe correctives to some forms of answer that have been provided for us. There's a very interesting novel. It is called Love and Garbage. It's by the Czech writer Ivan Klima. Klima was asked whether he would become the foreign minister of what was then Czechoslovakia when Havel became its president after the so-called Velvet Revolution. He said he couldn't because he had to keep writing novels. I think the novels, unfortunately, that came after the Velvet Revolution aren't very good. This one was before. And what does he talk about in this novel? Well, of course, many things. One is opening a space in which the soul can move and breathe. But you can't quantify the direction that the soul, so-called, might take within that space. That would be an open matter. Garbage had to do, his most graphic example is a woman who just collects things. She's kind of a pack rat. Not very economically advantaged. But he says of her, not all the things in the world would fill that empty space. Not all the things, however useless or useful. He plays very well on how we can overuse things, use them up, abuse them, how often things become refuse that we live with. He says very disturbing things about the Khmer Rouge and how what they were doing, he suggests, now this is the novel, not the novelist, that all the violence in the world would not remedy that inner emptiness that they have. Does this make sense? I'm not sure I can tell you altogether that it does, because it's very hard to talk about something that you can't provide the contours for. It's easier, much easier to talk about a content that might fill a space than to talk about the opening of a space. And when you open that space, maybe one of the very first things you have to do is empty out what had come to fill it. Maybe fill it to the point that you hadn't realized what the stuff was filling was a space that you had to renew your experience with. I think this is so terribly important and difficult, partly because as I listen to it being talked about, and by multiple people, whether in the philosophical or psychoanalytic community, there's a kind of consistent worry they have that this sounds new agey in a way that would maybe have some people in some quarters disparage it or think they already knew about it or lived through it in the 60s and 70s or whatever. But this is actually very serious material. There's a book, I don't know I should recommend it, I haven't actually read it through yet, that Bob Stoller wrote, which I believe probably grew out of, may have been his doctoral dissertation. This is probably the central figure at the Institute for Contemporary Psychoanalysis. It's called Trauma and Existence. As if there might be some trauma. Oh, this sounds heavy and deep, doesn't it? At the core of our existence. It takes me back to my Scandinavian roots and Kierkegaard and angst and all that bad stuff. But is there just possibly something important to listen to tap into, to understand about that? A standard staple of the so-called existential movement has been a fundamental distinction between pathological anxiety and ontological anxiety. We all know what's being talked about here, though this is polysyllabic, big-time labeling of it. Maybe some forms of angst are appropriate. They're not the kind that by watching the evening news and one of its commercials you can label and then find a medication for. And maybe it's even a good rather than a bad thing to have this kind of angst. But it doesn't sound terribly positive, does it? Does it sound, well, what does it sound like? What is its resonance for you? Could it be possible that issues regarding who we are and ways in which we're really not altogether of this world, and neither art nor religion, as we have known them, have quite yet touched that? Is there some fundamental reality to this experience that we can begin to talk about constructively? I don't know what your life is like. I'll tell you what my wife's and my life is like. We're very busy, and we do a lot of writing and reading and talking. And sometimes we think there are breakthroughs. Other times we think it might involve, well, maybe not willing to linger in the comma, maybe not being able to think in the following way, that a space has to be cultivated, a kind of fundamental space. A philosopher that matters to me, Heidegger, said, it's hard to do this in an age which only counts what moves fast and can be numbered. Nobel Prize winners coming out of MIT and elsewhere set up a special capital fund. You know about it perhaps in the 90s. It's called long-term capital management. And lo and behold, everybody wanted to pile in there because if you got world-famous Nobel Prize winners in economics and mathematics, how could you go wrong? Well, If you may remember, it went belly up in 1998. Or consider the theory, which may be true or false, that statistical models, which were highly sophisticated, also contributed substantially to the kinds of problems that surfaced altogether in 2008 and which linger in our time. There's mysticism and logic. Mysticism sounds problematic. Logic sounds maybe severe or sterile. Is there a logic to a space that could be opening? Or is it just a terribly, terribly difficult notion to get our hands around because we can't quite understand its parameters? Some time ago, a number of people, and I think a number of you are among them, began to explore the notion that what might develop are small communities that will find ways to interact with each other. As best I can understand applied brilliance, which I think is an extraordinary and wonderful undertaking which no one can know the future of, it involves this sort of activity. But I don't know how you quantify or measure where it will go or what it will be. What is a truly interactive space like? Before the trapdoor opens and I have left the stage, I think, Deborah, you said I was supposed to stand right here with both feet. Let me mention as one last notion something from an Italian writer, now no longer with us, named Italo Calvino. It's the last portion of a book of his, which is called Invisible Cities. The book starts with Kublai Khan, the emperor, who is wanting more territory to conquer, wanting to go further out into the world. But you get the sense in the conversation between Marco Polo and the Emperor Kublai Khan that maybe the emperor has misconstrued the real intent of what he's doing. He's looking for something that will really be meaningful. He keeps conquering territory to achieve this. But the territories he conquers turn out to be sources of his own undoing. It's kind of extraordinary. All the things that we accomplish, such as sophisticated mathematical models, nanosecond trading on the stock exchanges, highly sophisticated hedge fund ways of supposedly maximizing profit. And it looks like that hasn't worked out awfully terribly well recently, at least for those who open up the envelope and take a look at their 401ks. Well, the conversation keeps going on between Marco Polo and the emperor. But at the very end, the emperor says, I have to read this because my paraphrase won't be as good as Italo Calvino, even when he's translated into English, I think, by Weaver. The emperor is just in despair. And he says, well, what's the point of all I've been doing? I'm going to interject. This is not in Calvino. What's the point of my going beyond this comma in the way I have? What has been the point of these various triumphs if everything in the end leads toward inferno, toward mess, toward destruction that arises in the name of progress? And Marco Polo says, the inferno of the living is not something that will be. If there is one, it is what is already here, the inferno where we live every day, the inferno that we form by being together. There are two ways to escape suffering it. The first is easy for many. Accept the inferno and become such a part of it that you can no longer see it. The second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno. Then make them endure, give them space. Once again, the second is risky and demands constant vigilance and apprehension. Seek and learn to recognize who and what in the midst of the inferno are not inferno. Then make them endure, give them space. Well, I think if we could really do that, it would be extraordinary. It's a great challenge because we're very active, productive people. And maybe sometimes that can get in the way. I watched Steve Jobs' commencement address on YouTube that he gave up at Stanford. And at the end, he pays tribute to those who did the whole world catalog, about which I knew nothing, which I guess went out of business in the 1970s before the advent of what we'll think of the computer and internet revolution. And Jobs ends his commencement address, which was probably not fully appreciated by the Stanford faculty, you could see them squirming, by stating what was on the last page of the last issue of the whole Earth catalog, which simply said, and it was his charge to the class at Stanford, stay hungry and stay foolish. Well, if we could be hungry and foolish and a little more open and willing in certain ways to pause, as I think this occasion is, I think it gives us extraordinary hope. And I would say a lot more to you, but there's a big sign here that says, my revels are ended. Thank you very much for listening.